This week on Inside Olympia, rebuilding local news in an era of declining offerings. Why is it important? What are the new funding models? Where are the opportunities? And what are the hurdles? On the program, Kaarin Austin, founding director of the Washington News Fund, and Matt Powers, professor of communication at the University of Washington. Welcome to Inside Olympia. Since 2005, Washington State has lost more than 20% of its newspapers, and 2 counties in the state now have no local news site. Newspaper staffing in the state is down about 2/3. The number of reporters at the state capitol fell from 19 in 2000 to 8 in 2023. That's according to recent reports on the state of media by the League of Women Voters, Washington State University, and the University of Washington. But now there are several initiatives in the state to rebuild local news. What are the opportunities and barriers? Where will the funding come from? What are the new models for the digital and AI age? And why is local news important? This week we continue our ongoing look at the state of Washington's media ecosystem. Joining me now, and for the full hour, is Kaarin Austin, founding director of the Washington News Fund, and Matt Powers, who's back on the program, professor of communication at the University of Washington and co-director of the Center for Journalism, Media, and Democracy. Welcome, both of you, to Inside Olympia. Good to see you. First time guest?
Yes.
Second time, maybe third time guest? By the way, we are calling this the Austin Powers show.
Yes, we heard. It's fitting.
Why not? I mean, I'm only going to get to do this once probably, so we're going to go for it. Or maybe it's the Austin Powers.
Yeah.
Right. Austin squared powers, whatever it may be.
Yeah, it works.
Let me start with you, Kaarin, because
from the TVW studio, it's Inside Olympia with host Austin Jenkins.
KNKX. You are new to this organization, and it's new. So why don't you introduce us to the Washington News Fund, what it is, what its mission is.
Yeah, so the Washington News Fund was formed actually about 1.5 years ago by a collaboration of community foundations from all across the state. And it is a response to the national Press Forward movement. So Press Forward at the national level is a movement to infuse money into local news through philanthropy. So the goal was at the national level through Press Forward to get $500 million infused all across the country into local news. So it was the Knight Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation, other kind of big names in journalism fundraising that got together and said, okay, philanthropists, this is our time to show up in local news and information. So that started 3 years ago. Here in Washington State, you had community foundations from all over the state. We have 7 members of our collaborative. 5 of those serve on the founding council. And so they started Press Forward Washington about 1.5 years ago. They funded it and started it up and got a founding grant from Press Forward National to be able to hire a staff person. So I came on about 5 months ago and have been partnership building and getting the word out about it since then. So the goal is to raise philanthropic dollars for local news.
And we'll talk much more about how that's going to work and what the building blocks are. Matt, let me bring you in. You and I last spoke about your study of State House reporting declining in this state and how that is important by itself, but it's also kind of a microcosm of sort of a broader trend. And we've well established on this program the problem, right? We've talked to the League of Women Voters. We've talked with Professor Jennifer Henriksen at WSU about her reporting or studies on decline of local reporting in the state, and then of course your State House reporting. Maybe we can start to turn the corner and talk about solutions. But what's in your mind as you think about the work that Kaarin is doing, and you're kind of thinking about what you might be looking at next as you sort of push down this path?
Yeah. So it's a great question. I think what Kaarin is doing is very exciting. I think it's very important. I would say at the top level, the important thing to keep in mind is there's not going to be one solution because there's not just one problem for journalism. Journalism has many problems. It has an economic problem for many organizations, which is how to get revenue. It has social problems, which is how to actually get people to consume the news. And it has political problems in the sense of how do they respond to the fact that you can expose corruption and nothing can happen sometimes. And we've seen this at the national level quite a lot. So I think there's many different problems that are well understood. And the question is going to be, what are the appropriate solutions for the different problems? in terms of thinking about local news, I do think one of the interesting questions right now in terms of thinking about solutions is to try and think about not just the production of local news, which is very, very important, particularly in places that are outside, capital cities and outside of big cities and stuff like that, but to look at places that don't actually have traditional, newspapers, broadcast media at this point, and rather than start from just the assumption that we know what to provide, to actually go in and really to understand when people want to find out what's going on at their kid's school, where do they turn? Who do they talk to? When people want to know what's going on with the construction in their neighborhood, where do they turn and who do they talk to? And I think that's really an opportunity here in terms of understanding how information fits into people's everyday lives, and then figuring out how journalism can actually adapt itself to make sure that it's well adjusted to the different information needs that people have.
That seems like an important point because the way that we get our information has changed so much. So if you were to go back and try to, even if you could, rebuild the model of yesterday, it wouldn't probably be very effective. And I think what you're also getting at is this idea of demand versus supply. We've sort of established well that the supply of news is diminished, but what do people want? What are they demanding? What would they consume? Where would they go to find it? So Kaarin, in terms of the work that you and the funders are doing, how much are they, we've established the problem, how much are they thinking about what the solution would look like? Where do you find the audiences, meet their needs, build them up?
Matt and I are both interested in the demand side of this conversation. I think the fund being led by community foundations is really powerful in this case because community foundations are responsive to and accountable to the communities across the state.
And just to be clear, are these community foundations, who's funding them? And what's their source?
They are typically funded by individual donors. You might hear donor advised fund donors, and other larger funders will sometimes fund community foundations
So
as
it's
well.
Whatcom Community Foundation, Yakima Valley, Blue Mountain, which is, I imagine, in Walla Walla and Southeast, Community Foundation of South Puget Sound, and Greater Tacoma Community Foundation. Those are your founding councils.
Those are that's the founding council, yes. And then members of the collaborative are also the Community Foundation of Snohomish County and Innovia, which was the inland northwest Spokane.
So you were saying that, so they're thinking about this too.
They're thinking, they are absolutely thinking about this. They, for community foundations to kind of pick their head up to a statewide level is, I think, really powerful. Really shows the gravity of this need across the state, because community foundations really are typically focused on their community, right? But each community does need something a little different. So having the voice of each community, this is the whether it's age, demographics, rural versus urban, cultural, all of this matters in how we consume news, and we do need to learn more about this, how people are wanting to consume the news before we have a big bet on what's going to work.
Where is the initial focus?
So we have 4 focus areas that are sustainability, equity, policy, and infrastructure. So Press Forward as a whole and the Washington chapter, the Washington News Fund, are really looking at what is going to make a sustainable ecosystem. It's less about, you mentioned nostalgia, it's less about kind of saving local news and more about investing in what's working and what might work, especially when it comes to business model. So what's a sustainable business model for local news, I think.
And is it necessarily nonprofit news, for-profit? Are you agnostic about the platform or the type of news?
Yeah, pretty agnostic about that. There are some for-profit outlets that have figured out how to get nonprofit funding in really interesting ways. There are some really exciting nonprofits out there. There's also some really exciting for-profit digital startups. So we're pretty agnostic about that. We're also agnostic about platform. It's really about, is the community getting information?
What about legacy versus new media?
Yep, both matter and both have their place.
What do you think, Matt, about this, going back to this demand side? As you think, I notice people getting, I wouldn't necessarily say it's news, but information on social media a lot. And in fact, at a local level, and I often use this example, here in Thurston County, we have an elected sheriff who is very effective, and maybe it's generational, I think. He's pretty young, but very effective on social media as his own best PR.
Absolutely.
And then you've got a group of volunteers who monitor the police scanners and report on that, not in the fashion that professional journalists would, but they've got legions of followers. So in some respects, those two examples seem to be filling a void, but they're not traditional journalism, and they're not, they're not a one-to-one replacement, I guess is what I'm trying to say. But they are also finding audience.
All of them are important, I think. And I think the examples you give, the local ones, Thurston County, those are evidence of people reveal their preferences through their actual consumption. And so people will say, I'd like this, I'd like that, but people click on what they actually find interesting. They consume what they actually want. And I think that that's an indication that there are certain things that news organizations used to do that it's probably not really worth their time to spend as much time on doing. For instance, you have a reporter who goes and reports on a press conference at the police station. Okay, if you've already got, someone who's directly reaching the public, is it really the best use of a reporter's time to go and simply relay what it is that the police, chief is saying? It might actually be better to do some of the accountability reporting that would actually be important and useful. So I think in terms of the audience side, in terms of what gets consumed, I think we can learn a lot about what actually is interesting and is useful to people just by looking at where they actually click, what they actually consume, how they actually answer these basic questions of, what types of information do I need to live my life, right?
Let me ask you also kind of an existential question, at least existential for a legacy reporter, which is, do we have to just accept that all journalism and perhaps information is going to be filtered through social media and that's where people will receive it? Or can we try to bring people back to more of a model where they're getting the news directly from the platform, whether that be a new platform or something that's historically been around?
So my sense is that just in terms of the economics and the infrastructure is that so much of it happens through platforms at this point, and publishers are not unaware of the difficulties and the trade-offs, and they still make the decision that they're going to go through because the reach is greater.
They're going to post their stories on these platforms.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I don't think that's actually going to change. I mean, at least not anytime in the foreseeable future. I think the large language models, AI, will actually intensify that. It will create further economic issues for publishers because they're not actually going to get the advertising revenues because no one's going to be clicking through. So there's going to be interesting and important issues there. I don't think, however, that means that it's going to be impossible to get people to actually come to either your website or to subscribe to your newspaper or your magazine. The question is really, does that website offer something, does that television program offer something that they can't already get elsewhere?
So Kaarin, given your background in public media and mine as well, where when you have a radio station or if you're a PBS TV station, you have the broadcast airwaves and you can go to your audience once or twice or 3 or 4 times a year and ask them to contribute. It's pretty powerful.
Yeah.
It's not easy.
Yeah.
But now that you are working with media organizations that don't have that megaphone, again, whether they be a startup or it's a newspaper just trying to get subscribers, what are your thoughts on sort of how do you start to create that sort of virtuous cycle of getting people to reinvest, whether you're a grant maker or the potential subscriber in this local news ecosystem?
One of the things that public media has done really well for a long time is those 3 times a year is really share the value, right? I think this has been said on your show before, but journalism has a PR problem. There's that, what is the value to this service, but it needs to be not considered a service, it needs to be considered a public good. And so that is where the nonprofit model gets at that because nonprofits are seen as public goods, right? But journalism, whether it's a nonprofit model or not, is a public good. And so public media is really good at saying that about itself because it's built into the funding model. So I think other people can learn from public media. Journalists and news outlets need to be better about showing their impact, saying what it is about what they're doing that matters.
You and I were just at this conference together up at Microsoft, where there was, as an example, reporters from the paper in Port Townsend, Jefferson County, and it's a very small staff, like 2 or 3 people, putting out a weekly paper, I believe. We're talking about the enterprise reporting, investigative reporting they're doing, while also trying to cover the city council and the school board and stuff. But my sense is that in that community, that there is still sort of a recognized value that this is important, and that they have found to some extent an audience, and yet they're struggling still financially. It's not easy. I'm sure they'd like to grow the staff, right? There's enough news to cover, but where are we ever going to get the dollars to do that? So as you think about the work that this news fund is going to do, and maybe using a small paper like that as an example, like what might the future hold?
Yeah, I mean, I would love if the News Fund could eventually help fund all the small papers across the state. That seems like a tall order. So oftentimes what we can provide as a fund, if it's, I hope that we can provide direct funding to multiple outlets across the state. But what we've already provided, I actually spoke with the Port Townsend reporter at that event after they were talking, and helped work through with them what some of their stories of impact were, and how they can help talk about stories of impact. An impact story can be as simple as a reader wrote to you saying what a story meant, and just posting that to social media. That is meaningful. That is impact. So I think we as a news fund can help spread the word of what is working one place, and perhaps that could work another place. I think that's the power of the Press Forward Network. But eventually I want to get enough philanthropic funding into our pooled fund that we can give it out and invest, and help be a catalyst for some of these outlets across the state.
Did I read correctly that the initial grant, or the founding grant, was $75,000 for the Washington State News Alliance?
Yes.
And you talked about the priority areas. This is for infrastructure and coordination. So what is that money going to buy?
Yeah. So the Washington State News Alliance is a one-year project that is put on by the founders are 3 local journalists here in Washington State who have been working on this issue at both a statewide and a national level. And so they all said, hey, we're here in Washington. Let's help move some of these conversations forward. So the Washington State News Alliance has a couple of goals. The biggest one was the convening in Yakima that happened a couple of weeks ago.
So there was a big meeting? Or
Yep.
Medium-sized meeting?
A meeting, a medium-sized meeting, yeah. There were about 55 people from all over the state.
Different from the one that you and I were at.
Different from the Microsoft event, exactly. And that was, really, they are looking at coalition building among newsrooms, outlets, journalists, and adjacent and connected fields. So we had folks from health advocacy there. We had folks from libraries there. So really, it's about knowing that movement can't be made unless we're making that movement together. The reason we as a fund funded that work, so we funded the 1-year project of them getting out and convening these people and doing the listening. We are funders. I am not a journalist myself. I have done fundraising for journalism. As a funder, I don't believe that I should be leading these conversations. I think I should be listening. I don't want to be a puppeteer that is pulling the strings. I want the people who are actually affected by the work to be doing that.
So after 1 year, what would you hope the Washington State News Alliance as the grantor to the grantee, what's the deliverable?
Yeah, we actually have an MOU with them, and one of the deliverables is helping us understand our grant making, like where we should be investing money, what people across the state have said is needed, and then also helping us shape our policy. They're doing some policy work as well.
Then there's also a $39,000 grant to Washington State University and the Report for Washington program. What will those grants buy?
Yeah, so that is a reporter in every county, the 39.
The 39,000 isn't going to buy that, though.
No, no, the 39,000 is just a small helping them get towards their goal of funding that program. So that program was initially, it was hoped that half the money would come from the state and half would come from philanthropic funding. Now it's going to have to be a little bit over half, but some is still coming from the state.
And that's part of the Murrow program? Or?
It is, yeah. It'll be, so the Murrow Fellows have been a thing for a couple of years now. And this
Which is all about putting reporters in underserved areas.
Yes, it is early career journalists in underserved areas.
And it's state funded.
Yes. Exactly. So the idea here is to combine philanthropic funding with the state funding and partner with Report for America, who actually has something like 800.
It's a national organization.
It is a national organization that does something really similar, that puts early career journalists into newsrooms. And so the goal is to have a reporter in all 39 counties in Washington in the next 3 years.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's an ambitious goal, but it's great.
It is ambitious. So,
Yeah.
Matt, what's your kind of from your wearing your academic hat, when you hear this vision, and I think Washington is trying to lead in some ways on this and be a bit of a national model. I mentioned Microsoft; they convened a conversation about this. They have a director of journalism now. They're seem engaged, and I'm kind of interested in both of your views on sort of a corporate role as well as public dollars, because I think that raises some questions too. But what does this prompt for you?
So I think it's a hugely ambitious goal. I think it'd be an excellent thing to actually have, to be able to have a reporter on the ground in each of the counties in the state. It raises the question of, if you can do it, then how do you sustain it? How do you make sure that these are jobs that will actually be attractive to people, that will have conditions that allow them to actually do the types of reporting that they actually want to do, that will get them out in the community, and that they'll actually be able to do the sort of work that, basically for most journalists, like, people aren't doing it because they're making a lot of money. They're doing it because they feel like they're making the world a better place in their own way, right? And oftentimes it's difficult to be able to do that, particularly in jobs where you're outside of some of the big cities. Like, you're really trying to be a part of the community while also doing some work that can sometimes be controversial in the community, right? So there is a tension for professional journalists, because on the one hand, you want to help to build community. On the other hand, you are the person who takes it upon yourself to actually say, like, wait a second, there's something going on here, and my job is to hold people to account, and I therefore can't, not report on this. So I think that there's going to be sort of interesting pieces to that. The only other piece I would say about it is that, big picture wise, just in terms of like where the jobs are, the big picture takeaway in the US in general, and Washington State is really kind of a leader in this, is over the past decade, more and more jobs are offered either through things that are directly nonprofit, or public media, or philanthropically supported. And so, just to put some numbers on it, to give you a sense, in Seattle just a decade ago, the number of newsroom jobs, full-time newsroom jobs, that were either at public media outlets, so Cascade, KUOW, KNKX, or online-only news sites, something like Investigate West, that was like about 10% of all jobs. Now it's almost 25%. And so it's really become a bigger space. Like, that's a really important part. The second part is that even the commercial outlets are themselves increasingly reliant, for better or worse, on philanthropic support. The Seattle Times is a great example of this. I think it's somewhere around 20% of all their newsroom positions are now directly attributed to philanthropic support sources. So the way that they can do their environment and climate reporting, their education reporting, is directly tied to philanthropic foundations and support.
Well, I think, you've raised several important points. One that's resonating for me is the sustainability piece. The headline that I'm just looking at today from the governor is ordering agencies to look at significant additional cuts. So the state stood up this Murrow Fellows program a few years ago, but it's been challenged in terms of continuing and expanding it because of a lack of state funding. So, and that could be on the philanthropic side too. How do you so let's say, Washington State, and you guys won't do this all your own, it's a different entity that's trying to put a reporter in all 39 counties, but as you're thinking about and talking to potential donors about sustainability and long-term investment and return on that investment, and I know it's early days, but do you have a sense of how those conversations are going or will go?
Yeah, I like to quote one of my council members here who said philanthropy needs to be in this for the long haul, but the way in which philanthropy, the source of the philanthropy might shift. With Press Forward and the Washington News Fund, we're talking about those kind of big initial catalytic dollars, right? Catalytic funding or bridge funding, however you want to describe it, helps a news outlet give like the wiggle room for innovation, for finding their own sustainability. And then the philanthropy might then shift into more of a smaller gifts from more donors or direct gifts from major donors, right, to that, as opposed to a large gift from the fund, right? So I think we can provide that that bridge that some of these outlets need. That is one of the goals. You mentioned the Murrow Fellowship. One of the really exciting things in the partnership Report for America that they've brought in, Report for America, they have a really good track record of actually training up their local newsrooms to become their own fundraisers. So they give fundraising support to the newsrooms that are hosting the fellows to then become fundraising for themselves. So it's like a teach them how to fish kind of analogy. Yeah.
Before we go to break, let me just ask you a question about, I know one of the concerns has been as the Washington News Fund comes online, there's all these other entities, and Matt just mentioned some of them that are seeking already on their own philanthropic dollars, and the concern that your fund could come in and sort of be a competition for that or become a filter. So how are you addressing that concern?
Absolutely. I have addressed this concern multiple times with smaller organizations, and I absolutely have no intent of, stealing money from another nonprofit. This is really as opposed to redistributing the slices of the pie, it's growing the pie, right? And so this is the News Fund and the Press Forward Initiative are really trying to get more philanthropy on board, more corporate support on board with supporting local news, really trying to get those who haven't been in this space into this space. So, that's the hope.
And Matt, what do you think about public funding, corporate funding, philanthropic dollars into this when we're already trying to, when we're already dealing with trust issues and whether people, can believe in the press?
So they all already exist in different degrees and in different forms. So none of them are wholly new. And, we've already got all of them here in Washington State. In terms of public funding, I think the most important thing is to have very clear criteria that are generally understood and that have commitments that are done over longer periods of time that are based not at all on the types of content that people produce, but that are simply based on some criteria that probably have to do with like defining what counts as a traditional or a legitimate news outlet. So for public media, I think that's a big piece of it, is being very explicit and clear. On the philanthropic side, I think oftentimes the questions are about how philanthropic funding evolves over time. And donors, for very good reasons, want to, they don't want to be doing the same thing for decades and decades. And so you can see that there's trends in the philanthropic world, and right now, much to the potential benefit of news consumers, local news in particular seems to be something that at least some donors are sort of getting their heads around and seeing this as a real problem and a real issue that needs to be addressed. I think part of the question is going to be the sustainability issue, and the other part is going to be the question of who gets to define what topics, which issues, and what places actually get covered. Because a sort of well-known feature of philanthropic funding so far in journalism is that rather than being a race to the bottom, it's sort of a race towards the urban, educated professional classes. And so it's not that there's any lack of news and information in any of the cities or even suburbs or many of the suburbs around the country, but there are places that have less and less.
Just briefly, what about the role of a corporation like Microsoft, which obviously needs to be covered by journalists, but also is a legacy company in this state and seems to want to be involved in this, rebuilding, reemergence of local news?
So I think the form is very different, but the basic questions it raises are not actually terribly different from advertising-supported media, right? In the sense that there has been a traditional separation in American newsrooms between what actually goes on in the so-called editorial side and what happens on the business side. Microsoft wanting to get in and to be part of, the conversation in a lot of ways just makes questions about how do you ensure editorial integrity, independence, et cetera, in these conversations. It makes them all the more pressing. But again, I don't think it's totally new, because some of the philanthropic funding that's already out there is being channeled through the corporate giving arms of some of these major companies.
Sure. Okay, we do need to take a quick break. So when we return, we continue our conversation on the future of local news in Washington State. We'll be back right after this.
Stolen vehicles are a problem. We need a solution. Pursuits are not the solution to that.
Just hit another vehicle.
With the current pursuit law, you could literally have someone steal a vehicle and drive through a school zone actively at 100 miles an hour back and forth, and no one will be able to do anything about that.
Passing by school.
Welcome back to Inside Olympia. Our topic this hour is the future of local news in Washington State. Joining me once again is Matt Powers, professor of communication at the University of Washington, and Kaarin Austin, founding director of the Washington News Fund. We were speaking about Microsoft. We should mention that they did, at this conference, pledge money to fund some local reporters.
Yes. Yeah, they did. They the Murrow Fellowship that we were talking about earlier with Report for America, Microsoft actually pledged $500,000 to that program specifically to fund the 3 journalists in the 3 counties where they have data centers. So the intention behind that is to say journalism in these communities matters. Please cover the impact that these centers are having. They're essentially saying, I think they're doing good, right, with that. So you were asking where do corporations, and I think tech corporations are oftentimes the center of this conversation, because tech corporations are often seen as the reason that this has all happened to local news, that the business model has changed. And so Microsoft is approaching this in a philanthropic way. There are a lot of public policy measures that would force a company like Microsoft and others to pay additional taxes to fund journalism, et cetera. But this is another approach that they're doing it because it's the right thing to do. So.
And as you said, they're focusing on counties where they have infrastructure, in this case, data centers.
Yep.
They're having an impact. These are also areas where there is a decline, has been a decline. There's a kind of lack of local, I would imagine, journalism resources. Okay, so that's a specific example of sort of a corporation doing something more from a direct, I mean, they're voluntarily. They don't have to do this.
It's philanthropy, yeah.
But there is, you sort of raised the specter of, and I'll ask you this, Matt, about requiring, and the other thing about tech companies, especially companies in the AI space, is that they may have AI technologies that could be brought to bear to help local newsrooms do some of that accountability reporting we were talking about. But what about requiring the tech industry to pay? Australia is doing it. We've seen several states pass laws trying to get at this. Illinois is sort of a leader. There's obviously pushback and lobbying opposition when it happens, but I've been asking you, kind of going to you, Matt, for these like different ways to get at this. What do you think about the states mandating that industry pay more?
So it's certainly been done, or it's been attempted, not just in the US, but as you mentioned, Australia is a big case. Canada has tried to do something similar. Oftentimes the debate revolves around who gets the money from the Microsofts, the Amazons of the world. And the criticism is usually that it's actually basically a transfer of cash from one important incumbent business, tech companies, to another important incumbent business, legacy news media. And the question is whether or not it makes sense to structure the funding in that way. It's very hard to do these things, not impossible, but hard to do it in a way in which you do not pick winners and losers. And so that's kind of an issue in terms of on the policy side for making that happen. So that would be my sort of overview take of it.
Do you think it's something that policymakers in the legislature should be seriously considering and thinking about if we're trying to rebuild the local news ecosystem in Washington State?
I think if we're serious about rebuilding local news, then we probably have to seriously consider ways in which we can actually publicly invest rather than tax our way out of it. So in other words, it's very popular initially to say we're going to tax this group or this organization because nobody really likes them. However, that's not a sustainable long-term, usually not a sustainable long-term way of actually structuring it. I think there are actually models, like Western Europe offers plenty of instances and examples of this, where you make a decision that it's important to make public investments in local news because it has demonstrable important effects in terms of the amount of community engagement, the amount of, the extent to which people are actually informed about everyday issues, their capacity to be resilient against misinformation, all of these things. And then there's, I think, a question of like how much money is required and then how does that actually take place. It might make sense to have some dimension of it be a tax on some of the, the larger winners. But I don't think a long-term solution is always to go out and find villains so that you can actually find a way to support something that presumably is meant to outlast whatever the current villain of the moment is.
What is your comfort level, going back to this Microsoft funding of reporters in counties where they have data centers, of direct corporate funding for reporter positions?
So I don't know about the agreements, but I would assume that there's an agreement that says something along the lines of, retaining editorial independence, that there's no capacity for interference, all of that. As long as those things are very clear, both sides agree to it, and there are safeguards to make sure that there actually isn't going to be an issue with it, I'm all for it.
Do you know if it goes through a philanthropy? Is there sort of a pass-through?
Yeah, so the money goes to Washington State University, and then Washington State University pays the salary of the fellows, and the fellows report to a local newsroom, and so have local editorial. So there are a lot of steps of editorial control.
But I think this does bring us to that question of trust. I think that there are, trust in journalism, when you look nationally, breaks down a lot along party lines.
Yeah.
And so you've seen demonstrable drops in trust. I think Gallup polls on this over the decades. In general, you've seen declines, but when it comes to Republican, people who identify as Republican voters, it's very low trust in media. Less so with people who identify as Democrats. Now, we also hear that there is generally more trust for local media. But, I can imagine some people would be saying, geez, I don't know if I like the media. I don't know if I believe that journalism is important anymore. I'm not sure I want my tax dollars certainly going to that. And who does get to decide who's a legitimate journalist in this day and age, or which entity or outlet gets the money? How is your organization wrestling with that trust factor in the last you met?
Yeah, you said a lot of it that I would put a finer point on. Press Forward did a study that said 74% of people trusted their local news. And when they hear the term media, they're not actually thinking of their local news. They are thinking of the large national, oftentimes dividing local or national newses. So I do think that going all in on local, which is exactly what the Washington News Fund is about, it is about local news. When you see yourself, your neighbors, your community in the news, you are more inclined to trust it. We just see that in study after study. So local news actually unites. It has less political polarization, so the more people engage with the local news, the less politically polarized they are.
Do you think that requires, because you were talking about needing to, I don't know if market yourselves better, but is there a way that you're thinking about talking about the local news ecosystem and trying to make that distinction?
I would like this when we get out and talk to communities and ask them what we want. Part of that is sharing that message, right? And I think that's part of what the fund should do is help spread that message across the state. I think community foundations can do that, can lift up the local news within their communities. The PR problem, it needs to be a grassroots. But you saw this, and you mentioned the Port Townsend reporters. They were mentioning how they're recognized on the street, and people say hi and thank you for what you're doing. I think the longer you're in a community and the longer you are a part of that community that you're reporting on, the more people trust you and are glad you're there.
But we're also in an environment where economically, it didn't used to be this way. I mean, it was, and then it wasn't, but economically, the incentive actually is to be more partisan, potentially, at least at a national level. And there are a lot of sort of new models coming online. People who are partisan, people who are opinionated, people who are sort of, it's their own entity, and they can go on Substack or they can go on social media. And so we've got legacy organizations, we've got the public versus, corporate owned, but then we've also got solo operators. how do they fit into this ecosystem, and do they get a piece of the pie, and how should they be evaluated, and who's going to play God and say, you are a journalist and you're deserving of local news funds and you're not?
So I think that you're at a very important question, which is who gets to decide. One model would be like, okay, let citizens decide for themselves. Create a general tax incentive, tax write-off, tax structure where every citizen at the age of 18 or more gets, $100, $150, whatever it is a year, and they can put it towards, whatever news organization that they want. Presumably there have to be some parameters on that there has to be a definition, but, if the issue is that people say they don't trust the media, let them make the decisions, in terms of how they want to allocate those resources. That's one model. The thing I would say just about the trust thing at the level of the local news is local news does not have a trust problem. Local news has a consumption problem, which is an important thing to keep in mind because we often assume that if people trust us more, they'll watch us more. And there's no reason to believe that that's true because the level of local news consumption is very, very small and it's declining over time, and the level of trust in local news is actually going up. And so the relationship is not at all, a straightforward one. And that connects to some of these more opinionated things that pop up nationally, but you also see, in Washington State, where you've got people coming to the Capitol, sometimes, controversially, and, seeking press credentials. They have a clear sort of political perspective, if not always a neatly partisan one. And that raises questions of, in that definition, who's going to fit? To my mind, in a lot of these things, I would prefer that the definition be broad enough that as long as someone is, publishing at a certain frequency, as long as there's a clear editorial, chain of command, as long as there's a certain number of people in the newsroom, you'd have to sort of figure out what those parameters are, that I wouldn't actually want to get involved in deciding on the basis of the types of content, because that gets really slippery. Because everybody loves to throw around the terms of like quality journalism, but then what actually counts as that is really in the eyes of the beholder.
Well, have you thought about how you guys are going to define and who's going to get the money, so to speak?
Yeah, that part of what's coming out of Yakima is looking at kind of the I guess, there were sticky notes that went up and voting and, that kind of thing. And then this coalition building is getting that feedback from the people, right? So again, this is where I don't want to be the funder that's pulling the strings. I want to help put this grant-making strategy together that is what both the journalists and the communities have said they need. But at some point, there is going to have to be a clear guideline of what it is that we're funding in this round. So we don't have what our next round of funding is yet. But my hope is that it will be specific enough that it's not a mad dash for all, 354 outlets in the state trying to go after the money.
Have you set a goal,
Yeah.
Sort of a certain amount over a certain number of years?
Not over a certain number of years. We would like to bring in, the original goal was $1.5 million for this year.
Okay.
That's
And
the
then,
original goal.
and have you sort of established what the need is,
Yeah.
or sort of what success would look like?
Yeah, we would like to do multiple grant-making rounds so that we are able to cover all those, the equity, sustainability, and infrastructure. And I mean, we've already done some of that with our first round, but we would like to actually be touching individual news outlets or collaborations of individual news outlets.
How do you guys, just given that the word equity is it's a word, a buzzword these days.
Yeah.
How do you guys define that? What does that mean?
Yeah. So that is local news in areas that don't have local news. So that might be cultures, that might mean rural outlets. The rural and underrepresented communities have been hit the hardest by the closing of local news outlets. And so that's essentially coverage gaps. So where are the coverage gaps?
And I asked you about legacy versus non-legacy, but is an entity like the Seattle Times, which is the newspaper record in the state, a part of the conversation and a potential beneficiary, or are you sort of looking at them and saying, you guys can take care of yourselves?
Yeah, I am not writing anybody off at this point. I think it would depend on what the focus is for that particular round, I'd definitely be open to a conversation. Nobody is off the table because Press Forward and the Washington News Fund you don't have to be a nonprofit. You don't have to be a small startup. So yeah, nothing's off the table.
So let me loop back, Matt, on this question of, because you're reminding me that this phrase that we often hear now, that it used to be, was it Tip O'Neill said all politics were local, and now we're hearing all politics are national. And if the moth to the light bulb right now is audiences and viewers and readers going for what's happening nationally and internationally and not consuming as much local news, and there's this sort of, we'll presume, well-intentioned effort to rebuild the local news ecosystem. But people are only going to want to fund this for so long if there's some bang for the buck and some results. And how do you bring the audiences back?
I think it really comes back to that question of how do you make it so that it fits into people's everyday lives. There are a variety of examples of things that I think are adjacent to the world of traditional legacy journalism, where it's, original reporting and stuff like that. There are podcasts in this state of people who have, a clear political perspective, and they talk about things that go on in the State House, oftentimes quite controversially, and they do have audiences. They do have people who actually tune in. That is, whether people like it or not, that is one future for local journalism. And so that's already happening. The question is how existing journalists, existing news organizations, and those who are, going to school at the University of Washington, Washington State, where they're going to fit into this. And I do think the important question there is to try and figure out, how is it that you make news that actually is adapted to the types of things people really want? And there, I think that there is an important kind of disjuncture that is not the product of anybody having bad intentions, but is just a combination of, on the one side, journalists are much more likely to be educated. They're much more likely to find jobs in urban places. Their whole vision and their understanding of journalism is nourished by reading the New York Times every day and thinking, I'd like to be able to do that sort of thing in this particular community. And that's happening on the one side. And then you've got people on the other side who have very different information needs. They don't need the New York Times in their community. They're looking for, the sports results. They'd love to see, how their kid's team did. They'd love to maybe see their kid reported in the news. But they'd also like to know, who's funding, construction in their neighborhood and stuff like that. And so I think that there is a little bit of a gap, in part because when we talk about news deserts, we're also talking about places that, as a demographic sort of regularity, tend to be more or less, tend to usually be people who are, have lower levels of education, lower income, et cetera. And so I do think that there's a bit of a gap as journalism becomes smaller. It also is increasingly professional. It's like, in order to actually become a professional journalist, you really do have to go to a 4-year school, get a degree, do a bunch of internships, oftentimes go back and do a master's. And that just statistically makes you much different from the rest of the population.
So just to kind of close the loop on that then, what is that solution then? I mean, should we, one thought that I have is maybe we should be trying to recruit the next generation of journalists from those communities. Right. And because they will understand those communities better. They'll reflect, their own, rather than somebody parachuting in, even if they're living there. Yeah. But what would and I'd be interested to hear from either of you about this. How do you respect the communities that are lacking in robust local news now, but also don't need it, somebody to come from the outside and tell them what that should look like?
There are a couple of Press Forward chapters across the state that are doing really interesting things with media literacy in K-12, and so I do think there is a part of what is journalism, what does it mean to our community, and of course, what's fake and what's not and all that in media literacy, but there's also the importance of journalism. I know Murrow, they will prioritize people who are from a community if they want to be the journalist in that community. But, it doesn't mean that Adams County is going to get 6 applicants, right? So yeah, you do have to kind of start lower, start earlier, I guess, not lower, start earlier. Yeah.
The other thing is about sort of more collaboration in the
Absolutely.
industry, and there is this recent example of the Evergreen State Newswire, which is essentially becoming kind of an open source place for news organizations around the state to share content. And it used to be done that was either informally, or there'd be certain sites that were part of the Creative Commons. But now this seems like a much more organized effort. There's a entity called Plucky that's helping to sort of fuel this. What do you think about? I see the emails now. So every day there's 5 or 6 stories that are available for kind of cross-posting.
Yeah.
What do you think of this?
I do think competition is healthy to a certain degree, and that it's useful in any kind of professional field. There's a certain amount of healthy competition that's useful and good. News organizations have also tended to not necessarily have competition, but kind of like overlap across areas where actually it's kind of like not the best use of resources. And so I think cooperation can be good, particularly in instances where we're talking about things where it's less about actually direct competition and more about like, actually that's not one of the areas that we can cover particularly well, but these are people we trust, and so therefore we can go from it. The other piece of it, I think, is that you're having a transformation in like what the traditional wire service news offerings were. And so something like the Associated Press plays a different role in Washington State today than it used to, even 10 years ago. And so a lot of these newer things that are coming online are in some sense like the 21st century version of trying to figure out like how can we reduce costs while making sure that we have the types of news that we want, which is how the wire services came into being in the first place. That was their history in the 19th century.
Yeah.
It's certainly an industry that has historically had a lot of disruption and a fairly frequent cadence, and perhaps no more so than right now. But what is there, just as we wind down, the sort of need to create infrastructure, but also to put boots on the ground? How do you see balancing that?
Yeah, it's definitely a tension. I've called it the cart, horse, chicken, egg. Do we want more reporters? Yes, but we have a lot of news organizations that also need a better business structure, right? There's that, I'm a development professional. There's the, do we want a fundraiser or do we want a reporter, right? I don't want it to be seen in a binary, right? A good business model and good fundraising should eventually bring on more reporters, right? And so I do, it's a balance that we need to strike, and it can be hard to strike. The hardest is when a small news organization, I think Jen's study is like most of the news organizations in Washington State are at budgets less than $250,000 a year. When you are that small news organization, you can't pick your head up. You can't do that one journalism training. You can't do that one development training, that one how to write a grant training. And so again, that's where kind of this bridge funding that we're talking about comes into play, because a good, solid business model, good infrastructure really does matter for having a business. And they are businesses.
Because you're trying to create ultimately a flywheel that starts to build its own kind of momentum or its own weather system and starts to bring in something more sustainable, whether that's initially, but sort of the initial ignition maybe is going to be this philanthropic money, but you'd ideally like to see that, now there's more journalism happening, and now local readers are engaging, and now they're subscribing maybe.
Yep, that's the hope. That's the theory.
So Matt, as we wind down here, give us a reality check. What do you think success in a state like Washington would look like over the next, say, 5 years on this front?
Okay, I would think in a couple of ways. I think one way to measure success would be to ask whether or not more people are able to get information that helps them in their daily lives through news organizations than they are today. And I think that there are ways in which you can actually examine that. You can actually do surveys, you can do focus groups, and you can do that over time. And I think to the extent that people are able to do that, you can actually demonstrate it. And I think that's important to be able to demonstrate, in part because, to be realistic, journalism is a small piece of people's everyday media diet. And of course, people have to make decisions about what to pay for and what not to pay for. But well over half the country has a Netflix subscription, right? And people are very willing to pay for that every month. very small percentages of people have a newspaper subscription or some sort of comparable subscription, whether it's an online site, membership, et cetera. And so people are already kind of choosing. And so I think that's another piece of it. I think a second piece of it that we probably haven't touched on, but I do think is important, is whether or not we can actually get some of the young journalists who are going into journalism to stay in journalism. Yeah. This has, of course, always been the case in journalism, that it's a relatively short career for a large number of people, but this has become very intensified. And I think it's both a problem and a source of hope. The source of hope is that people are very aware of all the issues, but they still want to go into news. The question is whether or not we can find ways through philanthropy, whatever the things are, in order to be able to give the conditions that make the job worthwhile.
Okay. Yeah. I'm going to stop you there because we are out of time. Professor Matt Powers, thank you for coming in. Kaarin Austin, thank you for coming in. Appreciate the conversation. We'll keep having it.
Yeah,
we will have you back and figure out what happens in 5 years. Thank you for watching Inside Olympia. We'll see you again next week.